Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, thegreatcoursesplus.com. The Great Courses is, of course, the teaching company's Great Courses, of which I've been a longtime fan and user. And now they have an app. You just download the free app on your phone, you tap on it, and you go to whatever course you're interested in listening to. This is my latest one. I've been going through Native Peoples of North America. This is lecture number 17 I'm up to now by Daniel Cobb, PhD. The beautiful thing about the Great Courses Plus app is that you can skip around with lectures. You don't have to just kind of grind through lecture after lecture for an entire course if you decide you don't want to listen to the whole thing. This particular course is 24 lectures, and so like most courses, I probably won't listen to every single lecture. But this one I've been thinking about because of the whole national conversation on reparations for African Americans. And if we go that route, then Native Americans certainly have a case to be made. And this history is really disturbing. It's difficult to listen to because it's reality of what happened here in North America. So I think it's the kind of thing where knowledge is good before we make political decisions. But anyway, that's not the point of this. I just want to encourage you to log on to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and then you get a free trial as a listener to my podcast. Thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and you get a free trial. It's great. So give it a shot, give it a try. When you're driving, working out, doing chores, walking, hiking, whatever, it's a great way to consume content. All right. Thanks for listening. My guest today is the philosopher Philip Goff, and his new book is Galileos Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. So in this book, Philip and I, in this conversation, we discuss the problem Galileo's approach to science solved, and then the error he made in trying to solve the consciousness problem, that is, what it's like to be something, the qualitative aspects of things, redness, spiciness, whatever. It's not in the substance, it's in the mind, but we can't study the mind the way we study planets. That's the error. Then we go through all the different positions on the consciousness problem, that is dualism, monism, and panpsychism. His book is a defense of panpsychism. Then we look at model-dependent realism from Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow, and to what extent our models determine the nature of reality, because Philip is skeptical that science can drill down and get to the ultimate nature of reality. He doesn't think that's possible. We discuss free will and determinism and compatibilism, and how panpsychism wrestles with those issues, as well as objective moral values. And then we kind of pull out and look at the big picture of how his philosophy of panpsychism would lead to other philosophical positions that translate into things like attitudes toward other people and the environment and so forth. So we cover a huge amount of really the great topics in philosophy and life. With that, I give you Philip Goff. Thank you for coming on the show. Your new book is Galileos Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. I should point out, I'll have already introduced you, but I just want to make this point again, that as a professional philosopher, you also have the technical version of this, presumably the highly readable, popular version. Your technical version is called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. You refer to it often in the book. I haven't read that, but I did read this pretty carefully. I have to say it's still fairly jargon-laden, so I think it's good we kind of work through some of the labels and positions that people hold. But of course, the title is rather provocative. Galileo made an error? What, in his calculations of the planetary orbits, or what? No, of course, it's a philosophical error. But let's start with, since Galileo is such a hero in the history of science, what it is he did, and that is what the problem was he was trying to solve in his day, how he solved it, and how that led to the problem we have now with consciousness.
Yeah, well, it's a somewhat provocative title, but I guess in some way I think Galileo is to blame for the problem of consciousness. So, I mean, a key moment in the scientific revolution is Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. The new science is to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. So this is much discussed, but what is less discussed is the philosophical work Galileo had to do to get to this position. So, we think of Galileo as a great experimental scientist, which he was, but I think he was also a great philosopher. And he had to do a lot of philosophical work to get this off the ground. So the problem was, before Galileo, following Aristotle, people thought the physical world was filled with qualities. So there were colors on the surfaces of objects, smells floating through the air, tastes actually inside food. And what Galileo worried about is he thought you can't capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. You can't capture in an equation the redness of a red experience, right? So this was a problem because he wanted to completely describe the physical world in mathematics. So what he did was propose a radically new philosophical theory of reality. This was Galileo as philosopher. And according to this new theory, the qualities aren't really out there in the physical world, rather they're in the consciousness of the observer. So the redness isn't out there on the surface of the tomato, it's in the consciousness of the person looking at it. Or the spiciness isn't really in the paprika, it's in the consciousness of the person eating it. So Galileo strips the physical world of these qualities, and after he's done that, all that remains are the purely quantitative features of matter, things like size, shape, location, motion, things that we can capture in mathematical geometry. So in Galileo's worldview, there is this radical division between two domains. The quantitative, the domain of science, the physical world with its purely quantitative mathematical properties, and the domain of consciousness with these qualities of colors, sounds, smells, and tastes that he took to be outside of the domain of science. So I think, Galileo starts off the scientific revolution. I think that's still the paradigm we work with today, separating out the quantitative and from the qualitative. And I think that's why we have a problem of consciousness. If we want to bring consciousness into science, we need to find a way, I think, of bringing these two things back together, the quantitative physical world and the qualities of consciousness, to bring back together what Galileo separated.
Let's listen to his words that you quote in your book, Philosophy, and then you add, by which Galileo meant natural philosophy, in other words, what we now call natural science. Continuing with Galileo's words, is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. That's beautiful writing. He was a good writer. And that was another shift at the time where science became published in a language that the commoner could read, well, those who were literate anyway, rather than in arcane Latin that almost nobody could read. So the problem you're trying to solve here, well, the problem he's trying to solve is, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, before the scientific revolution, everything was imbued with agency and quality and, subjective godlike deities or, animated agency in the clouds and lightning and the planets were gods and so on. So in a way, he's kind of dispensing with a lot of this medieval superstitious, supernatural superstitions, which is good from a modern science perspective, that we jettison a lot of that. But the problem is that you're jettisoning all qualitative characteristics. But isn't it true that red doesn't really exist out there? It's here. The tomato is red because of the reflective surface of how the starlight, and the blue sky is not really blue and so on. So that is correct, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think I agree with Galileo on that point. I don't think that was a mistake. I think, yes, so he was right to take those qualities, as you say, that people thought were imbued in the physical world and put them in the consciousness. Okay, but that sort of, what's the phrase, pushes the lump down in one bit of the carpet and it comes up in another bit. Because then we've got, well, what about the qualities in consciousness? And Galileo thought, well, consciousness, that's outside of the domain of science. just focus on what we can capture in mathematics. So, I mean, this is the start of mathematical physics. It's this move that makes mathematical physics possible. What we've forgotten is that it was never intended as a complete description of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. And I think this is really important because I think so many people think there's a problem with consciousness, but look how well science has done, explaining more and more of our universe. And of course, it will one day explain consciousness. But I think this is rooted in a misunderstanding of the history of science. Yes, physical science has done so well, but in my view, it's done so well precisely because Galileo designed it to ignore consciousness. And the fact that it's done well when it ignored consciousness doesn't mean it's going to be able to deal well when we bring consciousness back into the story. So, I think in a way, I agree with Galileo on a lot. I think if he'd have come to time travel to the present day and heard about this hard problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative. So I think I agree with it. I think he got a lot more right than we get right now these days.
So it's delimiting science to what it can do best under that particular set of principles we're operating by, but that's not the complete picture, and maybe there never will be a complete picture under that, which I want to get back to Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow's model-dependent realism, and because in a way they're kind of pushing that even further. But before we do that, let's drill down on what the problem to be solved is. What is the hard problem of consciousness? Why does this thing stand out different than seemingly any other problem?
I mean, the way I like to put it, I would say the problem of consciousness is the challenge of how to fit consciousness into our standard scientific theory of reality. So, some people say consciousness is a mystery. It's a mystery what it is. I don't like that way of putting it. In a way, I don't think consciousness is mysterious at all. Nothing is more obvious and familiar than feelings of pleasure, pain. You know what pain is when you feel it, to an extent at least. I think the challenge is how consciousness fits into our theory of reality. We know it exists, so it has to fit in somehow. But the problem is all of the theories that have been proposed for how it fits in just have such deep problems, and one of the reasons I turn to theories that some might seem a little unorthodox is because I think they can avoid the deep difficulties that face more traditional options.
So the way you phrased it was, I think that everybody phrases it in the business is what it's like to be something. So I have a sense of what it's like to be me. You have a sense of what it's like to be you. I can't really know what your experiences are like. But I can kind of get a sense, and here I apply the Copernican Principle to myself. The Copernican Principle is that we're not special. So I apply it to myself and say, well, I'm not special. And I know my neurons operate the same way as Philip's neurons operate. We have very similar brains because we're human. And since I'm not special, if I experience pain and it hurts, very likely the pain you experience probably feels something like that. So I can extrapolate from that sense. And to me, this kind of, maybe it punts down the road, or maybe it helps solve the other minds problem, the philosophical zombies. I don't think you're a philosophical zombie walking around not really experiencing anything. Yeah. Because if I assume that, I'd have to assume I'm really super special just because I'm me. Even though physically I'm structured almost identically to you, in terms of neurons and how they operate, that just is very unlikely. So what you're after is finding out what it's like to be something.
Yeah, I suppose there are two problems. I mean, I guess what you're pointing to is, as you say, the problem of other minds. How can we know that other people are conscious when we, in a very real sense, consciousness is unobservable. I can't look inside your head and see your feelings and experiences. I think this is another reason why the problem of consciousness is radically different to any other scientific problem, because consciousness is unobservable, and that really constrains our ability to deal with it experimentally. I mean, just to add to that, because a lot of people challenge me on this, I mean, of course, science is used to dealing with unobservables. Fundamental particles can't be directly observed, but there's still something unique about consciousness, because in all these other cases, we postulate unobservables to explain what can be observed. You postulate particles as part of the standard model that explains so much of what we observe. In the case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is unobservable, and that is utterly unique, and I think constrains our capacity to deal with it experimentally. Although there is a lot we can do. But anyway, the problem of other minds, that's a very deep problem that I don't really have a good answer to. I think what you proposed is probably as good as any. I think that's slightly different to the problem of consciousness. So even if we solve the problem of other minds, even if I can know you're not a zombie and I know roughly what kind of experience you have, I still think we've got a problem. Well, I guess the simplest way of putting it, why are you conscious?
Right.
Despite our great, progress in scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling is somehow able to produce colors and sounds and smells and tastes. And, some people, this is broadly acknowledged now, some people think, it's just a scientific problem. We just need to keep doing the neuroscience. But I think what I explore are the philosophical underpinnings of the problem. And I think the reasons why it's very different to any other scientific problem, for some of the reasons we've already discussed, and that our current scientific approach isn't really equipped to deal with it, at least not alone. Partly because it wasn't designed to. Galileo designed it to ignore consciousness. So I think we need to rethink our scientific approach if we want to deal with consciousness.
So if we define consciousness as what it's like to be something, is it meaningless to say, ask what it's like to be this water bottle? You use socks as your example, what it's like to be a sock and whatever. The sock is not having an existential crisis today because you wore it 2 days in a row or whatever. You mean something a little different than that, maybe.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's meaningless. I think that's a meaningful question to ask. I think it's probably not true. I think there probably isn't anything it's like to be a bottle. So, I don't know whether we want to get onto this yet, but I suppose that the positive view I defend is panpsychism, that in some sense consciousness pervades the physical universe and is a fundamental feature of it. But a common confusion, it doesn't literally mean everything is conscious, despite the etymology of the word, which is panpsychism. Pan means everything, psychism means has mind. But most contemporary panpsychists would think that the view is that the fundamental constituents of reality, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, or perhaps fields, universe-wide fields, have incredibly simple rudimentary forms of experience. But it doesn't follow that every random collection of particles is conscious. It doesn't follow that your socks and that bottle is conscious. It just means that they're perhaps composed of things that are conscious. So I think it's possible. I think it's possible, and a coherent thing we can entertain that the bottle it has consciousness, that there's something that it's like to be it. But I suspect it probably isn't conscious.
So the main positions you outline in the book, although in your technical work you show that there's sort of subdivisions of these, but dualism, monism, and panpsychism is kind of the big three. And sort of walk us through what those positions are, and then I guess maybe one or two of the subdivisions where they differ a little bit within each category.
Yeah, so, when I, as I say in the book, when I studied philosophy, there was really only two options, dualism and materialism. My philosophy teachers told me they're the options. So dualism being roughly that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. And then materialism being, roughly the idea that you can explain consciousness in terms of the chemistry of the brain or the electrochemical signaling. So I guess I came to think both of these had such deep difficulties, and I got kind of disillusioned. This third option of panpsychism is, very popular historically, really, treated as absurd in the latter half of the 20th century insofar as it was thought about at all, but has really come to prominence. So when I first looking for academic jobs, people thought, said to me, maybe don't mention the panpsychism. But it's, in the last 5 or 10 years, it's come to be, in academic philosophy, a view that's, taken very, very seriously, albeit still a kind of minority position. So the middle way has emerged. But anyway, so should I talk a little more about those
dualism,
each of those positions?
Most neuroscientists or philosophers are not dualists in the kind of general public sense of that word, that there's a ghost in the machine, a non-material stuff floating around up there in your skull, and when you die, it floats off your brain and goes to heaven or whatever, or that there's a soul. Most modern scientists reject that kind of dualism, but there's different kinds of dualism. I forget what the label was now that you had here.
Yeah.
So naturalistic dualism. What's that?
Yeah, so I guess David Chalmers is the most famous proponent of this, and what he means by that prefix is that although he thinks consciousness is non-physical, he wants to bring it into the domain of science. He wants to say it's not physical, but it's a natural phenomenon governed by natural law. So Chalmers thinks there are these special psychophysical laws of nature. So he thinks, if in our universe there was just the laws of physics, then no one would be conscious. We'd all be zombies, is the word he uses. We'd all be complicated mechanisms with no feelings or experiences. But because we're lucky enough in our universe, we also have these special psychophysical laws, as fundamental as the laws of physics, but extra to the laws of physics. And they make it the case that in certain physical systems, consciousness emerges. So consciousness is non-physical. It's extra to the physical, but it's brought into existence by these psychophysical laws that just say, in such and such circumstances we get consciousness. It's just a brute law of nature, and we should look to neuroscience to find out what these laws are. So that's how he wants to. So neuroscience will tell us correlations between various kinds of brain activity and consciousness. Maybe you buy the integrated information theory and you think consciousness is correlated with maximal integrated information. That's one neuroscientific proposal. And Chalmers would say, great, if that's the true theory, then we've still got the problem. Why? Why does maximal integrated information produce consciousness? And Chalmers will explain that with a fundamental psychophysical law of nature. So some people think, it's important to think, some people think neuroscience favors materialism. I think neuroscience is just neutral on all these theories. It just gives us correlations between consciousness and brain states. And then we turn to these different theories to try and explain those correlations. And the naturalistic dualist is one approach to doing that. So this would
be something like water is an emergent property of hydrogen and oxygen. If you drill down into the molecules, hydrogen and oxygen, you're not going to find water. So consciousness is something like that. It emerges out of these sort of self-organized emergent property of these simpler systems piled on top of each other.
Yeah, kind of. I think it's a bit stronger than that, because I don't think many people would think you need extra laws of nature to get from H2O to water. Most people think, water just is H2O. They're just the same thing. So, I mean, I distinguish, actually, I think Chalmers came up with this distinction as well between weak emergence and strong emergence. So strong emergence is when you need to postulate these extra fundamental principles of nature over and above the laws of physics to bridge the gap, to explain the emergence. Whereas something like water and H2O, you don't need anything extra. You just have H2O molecules and, you've got water. It's like, I mean, the analogy I like to give, I always like to give the example of parties. If you have people dancing and drinking and having a good time, you've got a party.
Right.
You don't need extra laws of nature to bring into existence a party. That's just what a party is. So I think that the water H2O is kind of similar, but I think it understates how Chalmers thinks consciousness is something, although it emerges from the physical, it's really radically extra to the physical. So that's why we say strong emergence rather than when scientists talk about emergence, I think they generally mean the weak emergence rather than, and when philosophers talk about emergence, they tend to mean the strong emergence. So there may be a little bit of talking at cross purposes there.
One of my more amusing memories from TED conferences, it might have been 2010 TED conference. Anyway, David Chalmers gave his talk on the hard problem of consciousness. Well received, great talk. And afterwards, he and I are sitting at a little table. You know, they have these breakout sessions and people are just having hors d'oeuvres and drinks or whatever. So we're talking, and then Dan Dennett walks up and he said, "David, that was the best talk I have ever heard you give defending your position. And now I know very clearly exactly why you're wrong." It was the kind of thing only Dan Dennett could get away with, you know, because he's a giant in the field.
He has a habit
of doing that. He's a giant of a man.
I spent a week on a boat with. I spent a week on a boat with Dan Dennett in the Arctic and on a conference on a boat. So yeah, I had lots of these kinds of conversations. But I managed to persuade him he was wrong about something.
Okay.
Actually,
that's right. You wrote about that in the book, I think, didn't you?
Yeah. Should I say about that?
Sure.
It's a small point. You know, I didn't get him to change his fundamental worldview, but this is a small technical point, but it was whether dualism is inconsistent with principle of conservation of energy. So Dennett's argued this before, and Patricia Churchland have argued this before as well, that that if you had a soul, right, an immaterial mind impacting on the brain, that's going to add energy to the brain and so violate conservation of energy. But, what dualists have pointed out, I think they're right upon. I don't think dualism is true, but I think they're right on this point is, well, you could just have, so as I said, Chalmers talks about these psychophysical laws. You could just have them respect conservation of energy. After all, we have multiple laws of nature and they all work together to respect conservation of energy. So why not these extra laws? And actually, I said this in the Q&A for Paul Churchland's talk, and everyone turned on me and was like, "Oh, you believe in magic?" And I was like, "No, I'm not a dualist. I just don't think that they're wrong for this reason." And then I didn't get very far in the Q&A. One of the graduate students said to me later, "They turned on you like a pack of wolves." But talking to Dennett on the deck of the ship later that night when people had gone onto an island, and I just kept going, kept pointing, and then in the end he said, "Yeah, maybe that's right." so
very good. Anybody that could get a small point like that out of the great Dan Dennett. I'll tell you my intersection with all this. Through Skeptic, of course, we're dealing with what Murray Gell-Mann used to call quantum flapdoodle, which was all this quantum consciousness business, which essentially comes down to quantum physics is spooky and weird, and consciousness is spooky and weird. So somehow they must be connected, right? So in my debates with Deepak Chopra, I started looking at what his claims are, and I'm not sure what he is, but I called him a mind monist. He says he's not a dualist. He thinks consciousness, I think he's a panpsychist. Yeah. Consciousness comes from everything. So I call that mind monism in contrast with matter monism of most scientists. I guess you call that materialism or material monism. And maybe, is that distinct from Western idealist philosophers who hold a type of mind monism, believing that ideas are primary? That's slightly different, I think, right?
I guess I might be wrong. I guess I tend to think of Deepak Chopra's position as a kind of idealism that the physical world is not fundamental. There's something deeper than the physical world. Whereas I think the panpsychist position, I think, is slightly more modest than that. It says, we could maybe get into the details, but it's that the physical world is fundamental. It's just that it's infused with consciousness, and we could clarify how that is. But I think so I think I would say the physical world is fundamental, whereas I think Deepak Chopra and someone like Donald Hoffman, who I know you've interviewed, and they think that there's something beneath the physical reality. There's something more fundamental. So I think of that as the idealist position, although there's different ways of defining
let's see, how did he put it? Oh, so here's Deepak. We see mind produce matter every time a synaptic gap is crossed by neurotransmitters or hormones are triggered by experience. A person who is phobic sees a spider and reacts violently at the level of stress hormones, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, etc. This physical state is entirely produced by a mental interpretation that a harmless insect is cause for panic. And then, apropos to your book, Deepak also likes to quote famous physicists in support of his mind monism, such as Roger Penrose. Quote from Penrose: "Consciousness is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is known." And Werner Heisenberg, quote, "The atoms or elementary particles themselves are not real. They form a world of potentialities or possibilities rather than one of things or facts." In his 2017 book, You Are the Universe, Deepak asserts, "Consciousness is fundamental and without cause. It is the ground state of existence. As conscious beings, humans cannot experience, measure, or conceive of a reality devoid of consciousness."
Yeah. So I guess it sounds more like the idealist position. I suppose the big challenge for the idealist, it depends on the form, is explaining why we all experience this common world, right? Why we, if you look in the same direction, we all see a table. So I would answer that the way the materialist does. I'd say there's a table out there and light bounces off it and goes in your eyes. And so in that way, I think, panpsychism is more of a compromise. It's a middle way, essentially, between idealism and materialism. Materialism says there's just non-conscious matter. Idealism says there's just non-material consciousness at the fundamental level. But the panpsychist wants to marry the two and say, the fundamental stuff is conscious and it is physical at the same time. And, we could go into how to make sense of that paradoxical sounding statement.
Let's do that, because there you have the problem again, like back to Descartes. How does the mind stuff interact with the physical stuff? I have a thought, I'm going to move my arm, and then neurons fire and my arm moves. How did the thought affect the physical neurons to fire? It's something like that. How would a conscious subatomic particle, atom, molecule, etc., give rise to physical stuff that moves around?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good. So that is, fundamentally the challenge for dualism that I hope panpsychism avoids. So yeah. Let me just say that. The reason there's been a resurgence of interest in panpsychism is due to the rediscovery of really important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell.
I love that story.
And the scientist Arthur Eddington. Yeah. So Eddington, who's incidentally the first scientist to confirm general relativity, between the wars. So I'm inclined to think, as I say in the book, these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's a real tragedy that it got kind of forgotten about for so long for various historical reasons. But it's really been rediscovered in academic philosophy, is causing a lot of excitement. And part of the reason I wrote the popular book is to try and everything's so specialized these days. So I really want to try and communicate to a broader audience. So I'll just run you through their insight. So the starting point of Russell and Eddington is that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that seems like a kind of really weird claim at first. You read physics textbook, you seem to learn all this incredible stuff about space and time and matter. But, what Russell and Eddington realized is that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, about what it does. So physics tells us that particles have mass and charge, and these properties are completely characterized in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about what stuff does. So now intuitively, at least, there's more to what something is than what it does. So I like to give the example of chess pieces, right? If you're playing chess, I don't think I gave this analogy in the book, actually. I think it's an analogy I've developed. So if you're playing... Oh, did I?
I think you did.
If you're playing chess... Oh, if you're playing chess, you're interested in what the pieces do, right? You're interested in what moves you can make, what pieces you can take. But, there's more to the physical nature of a chess piece than what it does. There's, the nature of the matter it's made of. It might be made of wood or metal or plastic. So this is what philosophers call the intrinsic nature of a thing, what a thing is considered independently of what it does. Now, coming back to particles like electrons or quarks, by analogy, you may very well be interested in what physics tells you about what they do. That's really useful information. But you might also want to know what about the intrinsic nature of an electron, what an electron is independently of what it does. And about this, physics just has nothing to say. So it turns out there is this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. The proposal of Russell and Eddington was to put consciousness in that hole. So, we're looking for a place for consciousness. We've got a hole. Let's try and put consciousness in the hole. So the view is that is a kind of panpsychism. There's just matter, particles, fields, nothing spiritual, nothing supernatural. This isn't dualism. But matter can be described from two perspectives. So physics describes it, as it were, from the outside in terms of its behavior, what it does. But matter from the inside is constituted of consciousness. That consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter. So I think this is just a beautifully simple, elegant way of integrating consciousness into our scientific story. So whereas Galileo separated out in the 1620s the qualitative from the quantitative, what Russell and Eddington did in the 1920s is find a way of bringing them back together in a single unified picture of the world. So coming back to your question, I think that's why they avoid the problems of dualism, because there aren't two things here. There's just matter. Just matter.
So if we, to a non-physicist like me, I think of physics getting us to the true nature of the stuff we're looking at. So molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And you bore down to those, you get quarks, and you keep going, you get strings or whatever the bottom field is going to be. And there we find the fundamental nature of what that stuff is. But what you're saying is you can drill down all you want. You're never going to get there because there's no there, because that's not what science is designed to do.
Absolutely, yeah. So. I mean, let's just pretend particles are the simplest things for the sake of simplicity. I think the same point works with fields or strings or what have you. But what does physics tell us about an electron? Well, it has negative charge. What does that mean? Very roughly, it repels other things with negative charge and attracts things with positive charge. Like that's just about what it does. Or it has mass. How do we characterize mass? Well, it's about attracting other things with mass and resisting acceleration. This is all about what it does. That's it. So it's like telling us just about what a chess piece does, how the knight moves, but not telling you
what's a knight,
what it's made of, what the knight. So and then you think we do know what a chess piece is made of because you think it's made of molecules, but once you get down to the basic building blocks of matter, actually we don't know what this stuff is. We only know what it does, which is, of course, really useful information. And that's why we've got such incredible technology with rich information about what stuff does. And I think that creates an illusion that we really know what this stuff is, but I don't think we really do.
I read
there's a gap.
I read
there.
Eddington's book, The Philosophy of Physical Science, and I quoted that in my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things, because it's such a great example of the limitations of science. Here I was discussing IQ test and racial differences, that sort of thing. And, in terms of what you're using to measure the thing you think you're capturing in the head, an IQ test. Anyway, that's an aside. So here's his analogy. Let us suppose that an ichthyologist is exploring the life of the ocean. He casts a net into the water and brings up a fishy assortment. Surveying his catch, he proceeds in the usual manner of a scientist to systematize what it reveals. He arrives at two generalizations. 1, no sea creature is less than 2 inches long. 2, all sea creatures have gills. In applying this analogy, the catch stands for the body of knowledge which constitutes physical science, and the net for the sensory and intellectual equipment which we use in obtaining it. The casting of the net corresponds to observations. Now, an onlooker may object to the first generalization is wrong. There are plenty of sea creatures under 2 inches long, only your net is not adapted to catch them. The ichthyologist dismisses this objection contemptuously. Anything uncatchable by my net is ipso facto outside the scope of ichthyological knowledge and is not part of the kingdom of fishes, which has been defined as the theme of ichthyological knowledge. In short, what my net can't catch isn't fish. I always like that as a kind of a humbling reminder of how restricted science is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I mean, he's pointing to a kind of selection effect, I suppose we call these days. But yeah, I think physical science deals with the quantitative, what can be captured in a quantitative mathematical vocabulary, and it deals with what is publicly observable. Things that can be observed from third-person perspective. And I think that's a wonderful tool for many things. But it's not good for consciousness, because consciousness cannot be, the qualities of consciousness cannot be captured in that kind of quantitative vocabulary. You can't capture in what it's like to see red, what it's like to feel pain in that purely quantitative vocabulary, and also because consciousness is not publicly observable. It's so we're, I think people are thinking, oh, it's gone so well, that means it can capture everything, but it's gone so well in a narrow domain, and it's not really the right kind of net, as Eddington put, to deal with consciousness. Although, I mean, that sounds like, I think neuroscience is useless. I think, neuroscience is absolutely crucial for a theory of consciousness, but I think it can't get beyond, because consciousness is unobservable, it can't get beyond mapping out these correlations between experience and brain states. And that's not a complete theory of consciousness, because what we ultimately want is an explanation of those correlations. Why is it that certain kind of activity in the hypothalamus comes along with a feeling of hunger? Why is that? And at that point, I think we need to turn to philosophy to look at the various explanations of those correlations, or what is now philosophy? It's philosophy when you don't know the rules of the game. The subtitle of my book is Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. I'm hoping that one day we will have, as part of established science, a better methodology for dealing with consciousness. But as we stand now, I think it's in the realm of philosophy, because it hasn't been fully developed.
No, let's talk about that for a second, because you have that funny reference to Stephen Hawking and Len Milan now. Len's a really good friend of mine, and of course he worked with Stephen on two books, and he wrote a memoir that just came out. And you mentioned that, where they said philosophy is dead. So I remember when Len told me this story, when the Grand Design came out, he told me how that came about. But now he wrote about it here, so it's a really yeah. So so he goes to Stephen and says, "Why do you want to write that philosophy is dead?" I asked him. "It's not dead," I said. "What used to be called natural philosophy is dead, but not philosophy." And then he continues, "Natural philosophy was a precursor of the sciences, a branch of philosophy in which scholars attempted to understand nature through pure reason rather than reason plus experiment. It was rendered archaic by the development of the scientific method. Stephen knew all this, but I continued to make my case. Quote, I agree that today we can understand the universe better through science than philosophy, I said, but there's also the philosophy of life, there's ethics, there's logic, there's philosophy of individual disciplines such as mathematics and physics. Those branches of philosophy aren't dead." Stephen gave me a critical look. He obviously saw things differently. As I awaited his response, I gazed idly at him. Suddenly it struck me that the sport jacket he was wearing was a couple sizes too large. He seemed lost in it. And anyway, he goes on and on about this and says, "I have an idea," I said to Stephen. He stopped composing his answer and turned his eyes toward me. "How about writing, as a way of understanding the physical world, philosophy is dead?" Stephen grimaced. He looked back at his computer screen and resumed working on his response. Impatient for his reaction, I got up and walked around to watch as he typed. It felt a bit funny, as I wasn't accustomed to doing that, and I'd been warned that he generally didn't like it. But on this occasion, he didn't seem to mind. In time, he'd grown comfortable with my pulling up a chair to sit beside him. And this, to those who don't know, Stephen has a little camera on his glasses that's measuring the twitch of his muscle in his cheek, transduced into a signal on the computer that scrolls across and picks out letters and phrases and things like that. So Len says it took him about 6 words a minute was his top typing speed. So so Len went around to see if he could anticipate what he's going to type so he could cut him some time. I got to his side as he was just finishing his typing. His text read, "Your sentence has no punch." I answered before he had a chance to make his computer voice it. "That's true," I said. "It's less punchy, but to say philosophy is dead is an oversimplification." He looked back at his computer screen, but didn't type anything new. He just had his computer give voice to what he had already written. "Your sentence has no punch," it said. "I do get what you're saying," I told him, "but if we say philosophy is dead, we'll piss off a lot of people." He looked back at his screen and clicked again. Stephen could control the volume of his computer voice, and now his computer voice repeated, "Your sentence has no punch." So
that's fantastic. Where is that again?
That's in, Len has a new book called Stephen Hawking, A Memoir of Friendship and Physics. It's great.
Oh,
what I really want to ask you, though, about, because the deeper issue is this model-dependent realism. That is to say, they're arguing that the model you use to study the natural world is going to create essentially what you find. There's no correct. In other words, there's not there is a reality. This isn't solipsism, but whatever model you use is going to determine what you think the reality is. So. Here's Len talking about this that they developed in the Grand Design. One of the favorite passages would be a story I dug up on the internet about a town in Italy that barred pet owners from keeping goldfish in bowls with curved walls. Animal rights activists apparently considered that cruel because the world outside the bowl would appear distorted. It's the kind of tale that would ordinarily make Stephen smile and roll his eyes, but the goldfish scenario illustrated an important point he wanted to make about our knowledge of the physical world. Newton taught us that freely moving objects travel in straight lines. However, light bends as it passes from air to water. As a result, objects moving along straight lines outside the fishbowl would appear to the fish to be moving on curved paths. Now imagine a fish scientist formulating laws of motion to describe the motion of objects in that outer space beyond the walls of the bowl. One would expect those laws to reflect the fish's experience and thus to dictate that free objects travel along curved paths. Though that theory would look odd to us, the fish could use it to make accurate predictions about the motion of outside objects. Anyway, it goes on and on about this. That's their analogy with model-dependent realism.
Yeah. I guess in a way, I'm more traditional, what's called a scientific realist. Think we can at least aspire to capture the real nature of reality. Of course, it's always a guess. It's always an educated guess. I suppose, where I disagree with what Leonard was saying there was, I think people have this idea, philosophy has nothing to contribute, because I think people think that the task of science is to account for all the data of observation and experiment. That's the standard idea, isn't it? And if we can one day get this grand unified theory that can account for all the data of observation and experiment, job done. We've finished science. But I think that's not enough, because I think there's another thing we know to be real, not on the basis of observation and experiment, and that is the reality of consciousness. Right. I think we know about that not through third-person observation experiment, but through our own immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. But that's real. Yeah. It's part of reality. So just because your theory can account for observation experiment, if it can't account for consciousness, it's false, or it's at least not complete. So I think where we need to get to, I think we're in a confused position at the moment where most people, so if you religiously followed that idea that the only things we know to exist are on the basis of observation and experiment, you wouldn't believe in consciousness. Right. And what I like about Dennett is he's wonderfully consistent about this. He says, you can't observe consciousness, so it doesn't exist. Whereas most people think that's too radical. They do want to say consciousness exists, but they don't follow the implication of that, which is that, then we have this fundamental datum about reality over and above the data of third-person observation experiment. So I think where we need to get through as a scientific and philosophical community is to think, the task of science is twofold. We need to find the simplest theory that can account for both the data of observation and experiment and the reality of consciousness, which is an extra datum. I think we're just not there at all as a scientific community. I think if we ever get there, and we ever get to the point where we do formulate and have some societal consensus on the simplest theory that can accommodate both third-person observation experiment and the reality of consciousness, I think that will be the best guess human beings are capable of what reality is really like. I don't see why we shouldn't take that to be our best guess, not just how we perceive reality, but at what the world is really like. So I guess I'm more hopeful in that sense.
Well, you are in the way that when you were looking for jobs, there was no professor of panpsychism on the market, but now maybe there'll be something more like that, at least in philosophy departments. But how would this translate into or get put into a science department, say in physics or something? How could you test? Let me get to the point. How could you test panpsychism versus monism versus dualism or naturalistic dualism? And
good.
How do we know?
It's a good question. So, I think this needs to be an interdisciplinary exercise. And I think we need to think that, there needs to be an experimental and a theoretical branch of consciousness science. We're kind of used to that in physics, but in consciousness science, I think we're not used to thinking that there's a theoretical as well as an experimental aspect to it. But I can tell you very precisely, actually, what I think a theory of consciousness needs to achieve. I think it needs to satisfy two constraints that I call an internal constraint and an external constraint. The external constraint is to satisfy the empirical data, right? That neuroscience delivers the data about these correlations. The internal constraint is to get rid of explanatory gaps. So an explanatory gap is where you have emergence without explanation. So we've got X emerging from Y with just no explanation of how that happens. So the big problem at the core of materialism is you've just got this huge explanatory gap between the purely quantitative properties of neuroscience, of physical science, and the qualitative properties of consciousness. And I think no one's ever made the slightest progress bridging that gap. So I think it's easy to satisfy one of these constraints, but it's hard to satisfy both of them. So I think the dualist, like David Sharma's, the naturalistic dualist, has no problem with the internal constraint, getting rid of explanatory gaps. They just postulate basic laws of nature. I think that's a completely legitimate way of doing science. But they have problems with the empirical data, because on Sharma's theory, there would be all these non-physical consciousness properties in the brain doing stuff. And you'd think that would really show up in our neuroscience. We'd see the impact of non-physical consciousness on the brain, and you just don't seem to find that. So there's the empirical problem. Whereas materialism has no problem with the empirical data, but it has this huge explanatory gap. So I think the challenge we need to address theoretically as well as experimentally is to formulate a theory of consciousness that bridges explanatory gaps and is empirically adequate. And I think, panpsychism looks to be the best way forward there. So I think that there is quite an established methodology we can apply here, even if it's not the normal scientific one, because there are various features of consciousness that mean it evades that net in certain ways.
Yeah, one of my favorite cartoons is that one.
Sorry, that was a bit long.
No, that's okay. That's perfect. That little cartoon of the two physicists at the chalkboard and with lots of equations, and in the middle he writes, and then a miracle happens, and the other guy says, I think you need to be more specific in step 2 here. So I use that for intelligent designers who basically say, and then a miracle happens, and God does poof. And I guess one of your arguments is that materialist neuroscientists who go through all the neural networks and so on, and then consciousness emerges out of that, is a little bit like saying, and then a miracle happens. So to you, I would ask if everything is consciousness, that at the ground of all being, or whatever phrase we want to use, how is that different from saying, and then a miracle happens and poof, consciousness?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Wittgenstein said, explanation has to end somewhere. We
Very
all
good,
have
yes.
to have our primitives. But okay, so you might have a thing. Oh, isn't this just cheating? Right? We want to explain consciousness. You're just putting it in from the start. Isn't this cheating? I would say a couple of things. One thing, non-reductive explanation is perfectly acceptable in the history of science. An example that David Chalmers gives actually is, Maxwell explaining electromagnetism in the 19th century. He didn't explain electromagnetism or electricity and magnetism in terms of the mechanical properties science was already committed to. He postulated new electromagnetic properties and forces, primitive, and explained on that basis. So similarly for the panpsychist, the final theory of consciousness, when it comes along, won't explain consciousness in terms of something else. It will start with postulating incredibly simple forms of consciousness and build up on that basis. But it's even if you. So I would say it's a prejudice of materialism to think we have to explain consciousness in terms of something else. But it doesn't mean it's a walk in the park. As I've just articulated, there are tight constraints here, that constrained theorizing. We have to have a theory that's empirically adequate to the rich data of neuroscience, and we have to have a theory that's that bridges those explanatory gaps. And even in panpsychism, there are challenges on both counts here. So it's not like, an easy solution to just say it's there at the base. You've still got to satisfy these constraints, these theoretical constraints. And even for panpsychists, that's a big challenge.
I sent you that little passage from Pinker's Enlightenment Now, where he kind of summarizes that our best science tells us that consciousness consists of a global workspace representing our current goals, memories, and surroundings, implemented in synchronized neural firing in frontoparietal circuitry. But the last dollop in the theory, that it subjectively feels like something to be such circuitry, may have to be stipulated as a fact about reality where explanation stops. This should not be entirely surprising, as Ambrose Bierce noted in the Devil's Dictionary. The mind has nothing but itself to know itself with, and it may never feel satisfied that it understands the deepest aspect of its own experience, its intrinsic subjectivity. Yeah, that's again, that explanation has to stop somewhere, and maybe that's where it stops. Deepak got that phrase, the ground of all being. He got that from Tillich, who described God that way. Tillich did not have an anthropomorphic God.
Yes.
Just, it's the ground of all being. It's just underneath everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm fine. I don't have any principled objection to taking things as primitive. I think, science has to do that at some point. It has to just have its primitive postulations, its primitive laws. And it sounded a little bit like Pinker is taking the David Chalmers line there of just saying, we postulate these fundamental psychophysical laws. Although he's not that explicit, but that's if you're taking it as a brute fact, that's what it tends to mean in science. You take it as a fundamental law, but it's not that easy. Even if you, as I say, people think, oh, that's too easy, but it's not easy, because even if you take that dualist approach, it's hard to make it consistent with the empirical data, because it looks like you're saying there are these new fundamental properties appearing in the brain. And you'd expect from that if there's fundamental properties in the brain, you'd think it would obey different laws of nature to other physical systems, because there are these new fundamental properties in it. And that's not what we seem to find. That the brain seems to obey the same laws of physics that everything else does. So it's still a challenge, even if I don't think, even if we're happy to just go for primitives, it's hard to get the primitives to work in an empirically satisfactory way. So, it's those two constraints: getting rid of the miracles and fitting the data. That's how I see the real hardness of the hard problem. And that, that's trying to articulate more precisely what would solve the hard problem of consciousness? So that's how I think of what we need to do, and it's all about getting more precise on what we need to do, so that this stops being philosophy and starts becoming science. When we've really got an established methodology.
Yeah. The other thing I think about in regards to that is, people that have psychic experiences or out-of-body experiences or hallucinations. For them, they're real, and I can't say for sure that they're not real in some physical sense. And part of the problem is we're not aware of our neural circuitry operating. So when you hear a voice, the voice sounds like it's out there. Or if I have an experience of going, astral projection off to some foreign planet or something, that's what it feels like, and I don't sense my neurons tricking me.
Yeah.
But further than that, people that do hallucinogens, I mean, most people that take ayahuasca, for example, I was actually thinking about doing this, but my wife prohibits it, of taking a trip, because most people who do it swear that they actually went someplace, that there is this other world. The doors of perception opened up, and I saw clearly there is this other, and there's these beings and beautiful people and the colors, the sounds, and now, to me, I've never done this. It's indistinguishable from, somebody that takes just a trip. They all have similar narratives that they tell. So how do I know it's just brain chemistry, or the brain chemistry is just opening up this door to this other dimension? So how would you ever test that to see which theory is true?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good question.
And
it reminds me a little bit of William James.
Sorry. Go. When I say, well, I'm skeptical because everything I just said, well, the response is, Shermer, just take the ayahuasca. You'll see. And so let's say I do that, and I go, my God, you're right. And I write an article in Scientific American, oh my God, I was wrong. There is this other dimension. And then you go, Shermer, come on, you just took some hallucinogens. And I go, you got to do it. Come on, Philip, you take it. And then you take it and you go, oh my God, there's this other world. I had no idea it was out there. And then you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are really deep questions here that have no simple answers. It reminds me a little bit of William James and his wonderful chapter on mysticism in the varieties of religious experience. And most of it is sort of a psychological study of mystical experiences. But then at the end, he considers, is the mystic rational to believe that these are putting them in touch with something real? And he says, well, we can't tell whether our sensory experiences correspond to something real. We might be in the Matrix. I mean, he doesn't use the Matrix analogy, but, we might be dreaming. We there's no way we can prove our sensory experiences correspond to something real. I mean, you can do it in a circular way by using another sense, but there's no way to prove you're not in the Matrix. So he thinks there's a kind of double standard in expecting the person having the mystical experience to prove to you that it corresponds to something real, when we just take that for granted about our ordinary sensory experiences. So there are deep. I think that there can be an oversimplistic view about starting points. What are the starting points for inquiry? I think a lot of people would say, a lot of scientifically minded people, I hope I'm scientifically minded, but would say, well, it's simple. It's just observation and experiment. But as I say, if you stick religiously to that, you won't believe in consciousness, because you can't observe that. And so, we just can't hold to that. And so then if we say, okay, so we can trust, our senses, we can trust that other people are not zombies. And but there are other things like the famous paradox of induction. How do we know that the future will resemble the past, or you add this long list of things that it's okay to take as starting points, and then the mystic says, well, why can't I add mine? Why can't I add mine? Actually, the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga makes this point. He takes his sense of God, the sensus divinitatis, as it's called, as basic, and he says, I trust it. I can't prove that it corresponds to something real, but we can't prove any of our senses correspond to something real. So why can't I take this as my starting point? Now, I don't agree with Plantinga on that. I'm a bit more agnostic in the mysticism case, but I think there are deep problems here that that there are no easy answers about. At some point you just have to say, these are my starting points. These are that I take seriously. But I think, what I'm trying to press is that there's one starting point we kind of all agree on, except for Dennett. We kind of all agree on, but we're not recognizing that if you accept that starting point, it entails that there's another datum, a fundamental datum for science over and above observation and experiment, and we haven't factored that into the way we think about science. So that's at least something really pretty uncontroversial, something unobservable, something that is strictly speaking unobservable, but almost all of us believe in. And so, we can at least agree on that.
You mean
the mysticism
that we
case,
all have,
I don't know.
That we all have conscious experiences. We know what it feels like ourselves to have something. And your reference to Dennett is that he's saying that's an illusion of sorts.
But I think he's consistent. I think he's more consistent than most people, because I think, as I say, if you think, suppose a lot of people say the only things you should believe in is what you can observe on the basis of observation experiment. That's the only things you should believe in. If you follow that religiously, you won't believe in consciousness. So people are in some sense inconsistent, because their conception of science doesn't fit with the fact that they believe in consciousness, that they postulate consciousness as part of reality. So I think Dennett is consistent on that. And I think I'm consistent on that, but I think most people have an inconsistency that they say, I only believe in things I know about from observation and experiment, and they believe in consciousness. I think that's contradictory. But the mysticism, does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yep. I want to hit two other points before we go on too long.
But the mysticism case, I don't know.
Well, again, I tend to believe people's experiences that they tell me about. That is, the experiences are real. What the experiences represent is a much harder problem. I tend to think that people that take hallucinogenic trips, they're just in their head. There's no other reality that they're going to. But of course, I don't know that for sure. And as I said, if I did it and went there and felt like it was real, how would they disprove me? And so forth. So again, we hit a kind of an epistemological wall there.
I'd like to take ayahuasca, and Annika Harris, Sam Harris's partner, and John Horgan have been trying to say I need to take some hallucinogens to develop my consciousness studies, but I got young kids, so I think it's a bit tricky at the moment. I did when I was a teenager, but
well, there's these places you can go to. I'm told Sue Blackmore tells me you need to have somebody with you to make sure it's a good experience. Ayahuasca, apparently you vomit a lot, and there's a lot of dark emotions that bubble up, and I'm not too excited about revisiting those, to be honest, to get to the enlightenment that comes down after a few days of doing this. It's a commitment, I gather, but in any case. But I want to hit two other points that you discuss in the book, which I think are super important, related to consciousness and panpsychism, that is free will determinism, and then objective moral values. So how does the panpsychist resolve the free will determinism issue?
Good question. Well, actually, just to preface that, what I'm about to start, I've got a long-term project of that I'm really just beginning. Is going to be many years of trying to see if panpsychism can be applied to not just the problem of consciousness, but different problems of philosophy, like free will, like moral value, and to develop. So everything. I hate that everything's so specialized these days. So people, even philosophers within philosophy, work on tiny problems, and it's got to the point where, the people working in philosophy of mind don't know what the people working in metaphysics are doing. And so I want to develop panpsychism as systematic philosophy, just a kind of grand unified theory that can apply to lots of problems. But to answer your question, sorry, I mean, it's certainly not obvious that it makes a difference, because so two things. So the first thing is, it's not obvious it makes a difference because, as I said, the panpsychist agrees with the materialist that physics captures what stuff does. It captures the causal structure of reality. And so if physics is telling us the world is deterministic or roughly deterministic, then it looks like you get all the same problems. But I do develop in the final chapter. So the final chapter of my book is more experimental, and I do consider this in an experimental spirit. This is not a view I necessarily want to advocate, but I do try out this sort of pan-agentialist position.
Yeah, give it to us.
That in some sense,
give us your
particles have some
give
kind
us your
of
panpsychism. I have a dream speech.
Yeah, and well, actually, and I just thought this was just playing with the idea, but one of my colleagues at Durham University said, "Why don't you spell it out as an academic paper?" And that's just been published, called Panpsychism and Free Will, with the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society. So I'm actually trying to work it out rigorously. So yeah, I mean, the basic idea is so that particles have. So as I say, this is not necessarily a view I accept, but particles have kind of some primitive kind of agency. They're not compelled by past states of affairs. They, in some sense, choose or proto-choose what they're going to do. So then you think, okay, well, why is the world predictable? You know, if they're just choosing what they want to do, surely it'd be chaos. So the thought is that past state of affairs set up inclinations in the particles, and because particles are not reflective, intelligent agents, they're inevitably going to follow their inclinations. So I was raising infants when I was thinking about this, and you know, if an infant wants something, it's going to go for it, right? It can't sort of think, oh, is this a good thing? Is this a, you know, it just, I want it, goes for its inclinations. So the thought is, strictly speaking, particles are opting for what they want to do, but they're inevitably going to just follow their urges, their inclinations. So what's the advantage of this? Because I think the biggest problem for the libertarian about free will, you know, this person who believes in strong free will, is that on most versions of this, human freedom is radically different to anything in the rest of nature. So it just sort of pops up as this new magical thing. And I think that's really, really weird. And but if on this view, you know, proto-agency is sort of fills the physical world, and what humans have is just a more evolved version of what we find in nature more generally. So I think it's that's the attractive feature of it. But I'm agnostic, you know, because I think the important difference with free will and consciousness is we can make more sense of denying free will. You know, we can make sense of the idea that I'm not really free, maybe in the way we seem to be. Whereas the idea of, you know, denying that no one's ever felt pain or no one's ever seen red seems, you know, really much harder to make sense of. So I think of free will is not a kind of solid datum that we have to account for in the way consciousness is. But yeah, this view, it's a little bit, just very finally, it's a little bit like Schopenhauer had this kind of view that the world is sort of infused with will. So I think it's interesting to play around with that. It sounds a little bit
like Dan Dennett's Freedom Evolves. That is, we have degrees of freedom. So maybe with your example, the particle has very few degrees of freedom, maybe 2, and then the molecule has 10 degrees of freedom, yes. and the single cell organism has 100 degrees of freedom, and my dog has 2,000 degrees of freedom, and you and I have 10 million degrees of freedom, something like that. So you know, you sort of scale up from simple to complex. It's still deterministic, but there's an element of compatibilism, as it's called, for where you're aware of all the vectors and variables that are pushing you right or left, and you can kind of try to override them in a way. So here's how I think about it. Like the day I was listening to your chapter on that, there was that story. It was an op-ed by a couple of gun control specialists, but they're kind of libertarians. So they believe in the Second Amendment and so on. People should be free to have a gun if they want. But 60% of gun deaths are suicides, and that most suicidal people kind of know that they have this tendency, like future me is going to be dark and depressed, so I better make sure I don't have any guns in the house. So these guys are proposing that there be like a gun registry with the FBI that says, do not sell me a gun. If any time after today I go to a gun store, there has to be a waiting period, a cooling off period if I show up. So it's almost like there's two me. There's the me now, then
Wow.
the future me that I know is going to
Yes.
be dark. And so, anyway, I don't know if this will ever happen, but it made me think of what you were writing there.
I think that's really interesting. I think the technical term for this is a Ulysses contract.
Yeah, something like that. They've
Because,
done this with smoking
because
and
of what Ulysses did.
Yeah, you strap yourself to the mast.
When he wanted to, hear the sirens calling without. But yeah, I mean, and it also reminds me of Frankfurt's view of free will. Again, a kind of compatibilist view where free will is when you do what you want to want. So it's not when you do what you want,
right?
Because the addict wants the cigarettes, but the addict doesn't want to want the cigarettes.
Right, yeah.
So it's when your second order desires govern is when you have freedom. So look, I mean, yeah, and I guess so if you have that kind of compatibilist view or Dennett's compatibilist view, I guess the problem goes away there, right? Because you can make free will compatible with a deterministic universe. I suppose I was kind of and you're right, there are similarities with Dennett's view and my view, but I suppose the difference is I was imagining someone who rejects compatibilism but believes in free will, so libertarian free will, but still has naturalistic inclinations and doesn't want to think this is some magical thing that just pops up in human beings. Maybe God puts it there. That's a more, I guess naturalistic urge, as I think of it, is that there's a uniformity and elegance, a simplicity in nature. So it's trying to have a libertarian view that fits with those naturalistic urges for simplicity and elegance. But as I say, I mean, it's not that. I mean, I'm agnostic on compatibilism or libertarianism or determinism. So it's something I need to think about more.
So you're not automatically a determinist or a compatibilist, but you're not a libertarian free willist. I'm agnostic, but I would say. I'm not impressed by the arguments people give against libertarian free will. So either the philosophical arguments or the scientific arguments about libet and stuff. I think there are problems as I told you. So I'm not impressed that there's good enough reason to. I mean, Sam Harris in his book on free will says everyone rejects libertarian free will now. It's obvious. I just don't think it's as settled as that. But I'm not totally committed because I can easily make sense of the idea that free will might be an illusion. We might not be free in the way we think we are. So, I'm somewhat agnostic. Yeah. I tweeted out that study that I just mentioned about guns, and I said this is evidence of a kind of compatibilism free will because I can become aware of my future self and I can tweak the variables now. But some people respond, yeah, but that's still deterministic because not everybody has those controls, and it's determined ahead of time whether or not you can control your future self. Not everybody can do that. That itself is determined, and it goes all the way back to the Big Bang, or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that seems right. I guess you interpret
and then
it
the
either
other subject you talked about, objective moral values. You mentioned Sam and Steve Pinker, Sam Harris and Steve Pinker. I kind of fall in that category. Here's how I described it. So this is in the Giving the Devil His Due, my latest book, a collection of essays, in which I responded to this physicist who was critical of my attempt to sort of override the naturalistic fallacy or the deriving an ought from an is. It is my hypothesis that in the same way that Galileo and Newton discovered physical laws and principles about the natural world that really are out there, so too have social scientists discovered moral laws and principles about human nature and society that really do exist. Just as it was inevitable that the astronomer Johannes Kepler would discover that planets have elliptical orbits, given that he was making accurate astronomical measurements, and given that planets really do travel in elliptical orbits, he could hardly have discovered anything else. Scientists studying political, economic, social, and moral subjects will discover certain things that are true in these fields of inquiry. For example, that democracies are better than autocracies, that market economies are superior to command economies, that torture and the death penalty do not curb crime, that burning women as witches is a fallacious idea, that women are not too weak and emotional to run companies and countries, and most poignantly that blacks do not like being enslaved and that Jews do not want to be exterminated. Anyway, then I quote from I like Pinker's. His sort of foundational argument is this: that we are born just as he says we are born with a rudimentary concept of number, but as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truths and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we're born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions but not others. And then he continues, for example, if I appeal to you to do anything that affects me, to get off my foot or tell me the time or not run me over with your car, then I can't do it in a way that privileges my interests over yours, say retaining my right to run you over with my car, if I want you to take me seriously. Unless I'm a galactic overlord, I have to state my case in a way that would force me to treat you in kind. I can't act as if my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, any more than I can persuade you that the spot I'm standing on is a special place in the universe just because I happen to be standing on it. And then from there he extrapolates out to, for example, Spinoza's viewpoint of eternity, the social contract of Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke, Kant's categorical imperative, Rawls's veil of ignorance, and so on. So in other words, once we start reasoning about foundational principles of morality, certain conclusions are going to kind of fall out of the data, that this system is better than that one. I see this as a kind of moral reasoning toward objective truths that are really there. By there I mean human nature and the nature of social living. Certain things just are better than others, which is how Sam begins with his thought experiment of, the ultimate terrible world in which everyone suffers as maximally as possible. The moment you agree it would be better to move away from that, you've agreed that there's an objective moral truth. Your thoughts?
That's really interesting. So these are questions I'm really interested in. So I suppose, how I criticize Sam Harris in the book is saying, Sam Harris's point seems to be like, this is what we all agree that pain is bad or something. And so there's a point of consensus there. Okay, that's fine, but we still want to know what makes it true. It would be no good for Newton to say, oh, we all agree apples fall to the ground. We want an explanation of what makes that the case. But I think you've nicely, pointed in that direction with a sort of constructivism that, you've articulated how once we start this game, it might be objectively constrained in certain ways, and I think that's a really interesting story. I suppose I do think, again, this is all more tentative than the consciousness case, which seems to me so much more undeniable, but maybe there are reasons to be more of an objectivist than that. One thing is thinking about the norms of evidence. There seems to me something objectively wrong with someone who just says, well, I think climate change was caused by the moon, and you say, well, why do you think that? And they say, I don't know, I just got a feeling. That's wrong. That's not. Or someone who believes contradictions, that's just wrong. Or somebody who I think so I guess Pinker would, and again, perhaps yourself would sign up to roughly the David Hume picture that fundamentally it's all just about one's basic motivations, and Hume said reason is the slave to the passions. So what he means by that is when it comes to someone's basic motivations, they're you can't question them rationally. That's just what. But then I think there are some motivations that are just stupid. Like, suppose someone wants to dedicate their entire life to counting blades of grass, and let me add, it's not because they enjoy it. They don't like it. That's just a basic goal for them. That's just the basic goal of their life, and they sweat and they bleed and they toil to count as many blades. That's I don't know. Sorry, I nearly swore. That's stupid. That is stupid. So it's these, like, if we're just thinking about this is actually, well, I should say I had a big conversion on this. when I did my MA in philosophy, I was actually more of a moral nihilist. I thought, there aren't any facts about right and wrong. And I think when you're thinking in terms of moral value, like that's easier to make sense of, that, maybe good and it's something to do with our projections or rules we've agreed or something. But then my professors, where I did my master's, started saying, but you've got to think about how pervasive claims of objective value are. Like when we say you should believe the evidence, or like when you say it is stupid to spend your life counting blades of grass, or I've got the thing of, I still have as an adult walking on cracks in the pavement, or that's stupid. And so I think I find it really hard to deny that there's some objective ought here. Maybe it's not a moral ought, but some objective oughts. And then once you're in that, once you committed to objective oughts, I think it seems kind of arbitrary to rule out the moral oughts. So I guess I am more inclined to the strong moral realism, that somehow there are facts built into the universe about that somehow fix what we have reason to do. And
well, here it would be something like in our nature, we yearn to be free and have autonomous choices. Why? Because, we're a social primate species who are sentient and we're aware of our suffering and so on. Like Bentham famously said about animals, it's not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer, that we should care. That's kind of the ground, being the foundations of morality, something like that. The harder problem is things like, say, take the burqa. So as you know, Sam gave a TED talk about this, and he described these women as wearing, cloth bags over their bodies and faces, and this is oppressive. But okay, I mean, that's kind of how I feel, but I'm a Westerner. And, what if you interview a bunch of women in the Middle East and they go, we like wearing the burqa. We feel it's kind of humbling, and we're paying honor to our values, and we're not being forced to wear them. It's our choice. And so there I have to say, the deeper foundation there is choice, because some people respond to what I just said. The men are forcing them to do that. Well, even if they're not forcing them, they're behind the door during the interview, and they're going to beat the women when the interviewer leaves. But they're raised in that culture. So analogously, I used to be kind of in favor of polygamy or prostitution as a libertarian. I felt, well, consenting adults, they could do whatever they want. It's none of my business. But when you kind of drill down into what's actually going on, these young girls are raised in, these fundamentalist Mormon communities in Utah. They don't know any different. They're not making a rational choice as 19-year-olds like, oh, I'm going to marry this 60-year-old guy and be a sister wife with 12 other women. Even though the interviewer will ask them and they go, oh, yeah, and you see those shows like Sister Wives, they're kind of amusing to watch, but they're all voluntarily doing it. But are they? Back to the free will thing, if you've only been raised in a certain environment and nothing different, how free are you to make that kind of choice?
Yeah. Well, I mean that's I guess we're coming down to more difficult questions in applied ethics now, but I think I'm not sure I agree with you on the starting point, though, with the less controversial stuff, even though. So, you're saying, well, we've evolved to be free. We've evolved to have certain desires. But suppose there'd been a race of creatures that had evolved to, count blades of grass. That was their
right.
Or had evolved to, to try to believe what's false. I can't rid myself of the idea that would be tragic. Maybe there'd be selection advantages to them evolving that way, and so maybe I'm just so I guess it comes back to the question of starting points.
I think that's right.
I think many people that don't appreciate think, oh, we just believe what science tells us, we just believe what observation experiment tells us, but there's a whole load of things you have to just accept to get that going that can't be shown on the basis of observation experiment, like that the future will resemble the past, like that logical truths hold, like that that we can trust our senses, So, and I kind of think once you really realize how pervasive value claims are, and these claims about evidence or just basic irrational behavior. Someone else had this example, I can't remember which philosopher now, of someone who just wants to turn off radios, and that's their fundamental, or eat mud or something. Then I think actually the denial of objective value ends up being a radical skeptical hypothesis, akin to believing other people don't have minds or we're brains in vats. And again, it's back to William James's double standard point. If it's okay to just assume we're not in the matrix, to assume that other people have consciousness, why isn't it okay to just assume that there are objective moral facts, objective facts of value?
So much turns on where we start. Yeah, I've often thought the best argument for cryonics is I'd like to be frozen and come back 1,000 years from now and find out how all this turned out. The hard problem of consciousness, we solved that in 2350. Absolutely. That was a no-brainer. Oh, okay. What is it?
Oh, I can tell you, Michael. It's panpsychism. Don't worry,
see?
You don't have to do that.
You might be the Einstein of philosophy.
That will be Well, it's not me. It's Russell and Eddington.
Okay. Right.
But that will be the universal consensus in 50 years' time. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I've mentioned this on several podcasts of binge watching the 10-hour series, drama series on Einstein based on Walter Isaacson's biography of Einstein. And there's that great scene where Einstein is with Michele Besso, and he's walking him through the thought experiment that, two bolts of lightning hit the ground at the same time, right? Right. And you're the observer standing here. You see him, boom. And the visuals are great for this in the movie.
Yeah.
And then he says, okay, now picture yourself on a train and you're traveling in one direction toward one lightning bolt and away from the other one. The lightning bolts strike at the same time, but you're on the train this time. And he said, well, they still hit at the same time. No. Imagine it going really, really fast, like almost the speed of light, And he finally gets him to go, oh, the one would hit before the other, so they're not simultaneous. And the moment you kind of hear that and you see the visuals, particularly in the screen, you go, of course, that's right. So how could, so simple a thought experiment like that overturn 200 years of Newtonian, absolute space and time? Is there somebody out there that's going to do this again? To all these one of these big issues, and we go, oh, of course. And then somebody else like Eddington runs the experiment and proves that it's true or something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that thought experiment. And, I think some people sometimes have an oversimplistic conception of science, like it's just doing the experiments and getting the data. But, a lot of, as you said, a lot of big leaps in science have been about radically reimagining the universe we live in, as Einstein wasn't out doing a lot of experiments. He was thinking about what would happen if you rode on a beam of light. And I mean, the other great thing about special relativity is that it's empirically equivalent to the Lorentzian theory that preceded it, right? So they both account for the empirical datum, the Michelson-Morley datum, that the speed of light appears constant in all frames of reference. It's just that Lorentz gives this really ad hoc, complicated explanation of that, whereas there's all these sort of things that make it look as though the speed of light is constant relative to all frames of reference when it isn't really. Whereas Einstein gives a much simpler explanation, says it looks as though it's the same in all frames of reference because it is, right? And so, I mean, that wasn't about accounting for some observable data that the other theory couldn't. It was about a simpler theory. And, that's another mysterious thing we have to accept to get science going, that simpler theories are better. Right. Why should that be true? That you can't demonstrate that with an experiment. So I think, again, it's the question of these starting points that we have to sort of take for granted to get things going. I like to say there's another analogy with panpsychism, because so Einstein's account over Lorentz was much simpler but it had all the counterintuitive implications that time slows down. And so similarly with panpsychism, it's I think it's, it's as I've tried to argue anyway, it's much simpler than other alternatives, but it's also wildly counter to common sense. And so we should always go with theoretical simplicity rather than common sense. But
well, Philip, we've been going 90 minutes. Give us your, to close out, give us your, I have a dream speech in your last chapter about how panpsychism as a philosophy affects our attitudes toward climate change and politics or whatever.
Oh, wow.
I've
got to sell it now, haven't I?
Actually, that's your next book.
I had a lot more politics. I'm quite into politics. I had a lot more politics in the first draft, and my editor said, "What has this got to do with panpsychism? You've got to take." Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I always want to say, we as scientists or philosophers, we should be thinking not of the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. And I think, the first 4 chapters of the book are making. I think there's a good case for the probable truth of panpsychism as the best account of how consciousness fits into our scientific worldview. But it's also, interesting to think about the implications for human existence, and that's what I explore in the final chapter. And I guess I do think it's a picture of reality that's a little bit more consonant with human happiness, with our mental and spiritual well-being. So, materialism is quite bleak. You've just got a sort of mechanistic picture of nature and the cold immensity of empty space. Yeah. Whereas on panpsychism, we are conscious creatures in a conscious universe. It's a universe we sort of fit in a little bit more. We can feel a little bit more comfortable in our own skin. And as you say, I do kind of speculate it can potentially give us a better relationship to the environment. If you think of a tree as just a mechanism, then your conception of its value is going to be indirect. It's just, what it can do for us in terms of looking pretty or sustaining our existence. But if you think a tree is a conscious organism, albeit of a very alien kind, then, chopping down a tree is an act of immediate moral significance. And I think these terrible forest fires we've all seen in Brazil that, we're horrified by. But if you think of that as the burning of conscious organisms, I think it adds another whole moral dimension. So, I do speculate about, what it would be like to be raised as a panpsychist and relate to trees and plants as conscious organisms of a certain kind. And
I loved all that stuff. I especially liked your last chapter because in my engagements with theists, one of their responses is that, well, you materialists have nothing spiritual to offer. I mean, it's just stuff. And when you're dead, you're dead. And in 14 billion years, the universe is all expanded and nothing matters what we do now. But you're kind of building back into the system. Everything we do matters right now. Forget 14 billion years from now. Now matters, and here's another angle as to why. Yeah. So I found that very inspirational.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to who was it now who talked about the disenchantment of nature. Yeah. This sense of we don't fit into the universe. Look, panpsychism doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. It doesn't necessarily give us a purpose to existence. It doesn't mean it's not all going to come to nothing with the heat death of the universe. You'll still have consciousness perhaps, but it won't be intelligent life it doesn't solve all the problems, but I think it's maybe slightly rosier than the alternative. But of course, really we should be thinking, is it true with all of these things, with theism, atheism, panpsychism? We should be approaching the arguments and the evidence as dispassionately as possible. And I think that part of the problem with panpsychism are these cultural connotations that just still, it's changed a lot in the last 5 or 10 years. You don't get the laughter anymore. People take this view seriously, but some people still just can't get through that. It's weird. It's cultural. But I just think that's, when you think about it, it's crazy. That you should you should judge a view not on its cultural associations, but on its explanatory power. And I do think this is a view that allows us to integrate consciousness into our scientific theory of the world in a way that fits with observation and experiment and does the job. So the fact that it feels a bit weird to think that electrons are conscious is sort of a bit silly to worry about in a way.
Well, but I think you put it in a larger picture to show the context of why it does matter how we think about these things. Philip, I loved your book. I love all these big topics. What are you doing next?
Well, I've said the long-term project is, applying panpsychism more generally. At the moment, I'm working on something quite different, actually, on fine-tuning and, cosmological fine-tuning.
Yes, of course. That's a big one.
And the multiverse. So because as I said, everything's too specialized these days. And, there's a huge literature in philosophy for the past 20 years with this argument that scientists or philosophers who infer from the fine-tuning to the multiverse, that there's a logical fallacy in that inference. And, there's a huge literature on this, but nobody outside of academic philosophy knows about it because, it's on these sort of dense technical Bayesian articles. So one thing I want to do, I write a paper every term and I write a popular version of it. I think philosophers don't communicate enough. So I want to get this issue out to the public. There's such discussion and, of fine-tuning in so many spheres. But also, just finally, another criticism of the philosophy literature, they don't consider the details of the scientific proposals for the multiverse that, in terms of inflationary cosmology and string theory, which is just sort of unbelievable. So I want to consider in the context of the scientific details whether there really is a fallacy here, and also to write a popular version that gets this basic idea out to a broader audience.
Yeah, that's super important because, of course, theists use the fine-tune argument, particularly intelligent design creationists, to make the argument, that only God could be the fine-tuner. And then when you counter with, but the multiverse explains, why there are an infinite number of universes, a handful of them will have these fine-tuned parameters, and those are the ones that give rise to people that ask questions like this. To which they say, where's your evidence for that?
Yeah.
Well, there's no evidence for that. Okay, so you have your faith, I have my faith, end of story.
Yeah. So what do you think? Would you go for the multiverse? Or do you think it doesn't need explaining to start
I like
off with?
The multiverse explanation because from a history of science perspective, it's just one more step continuing in the expansion of our worldview of the cosmos, from the Ptolemaic closed tiny system, to it was only barely a century ago that Hubble discovered, that Andromeda wasn't in our galaxy and expansion of the universe. So it's kind of like one more step out. Copernican Principle, we're not special. We're even less special than we thought. Of course, that doesn't make it true, but I'm told by my cosmologist friends that it's not just an ad hoc explanation to get around the fine-tune problem because we don't want to go to the theistic conclusion. They say it's derivative of the mathematical equations, which of course I don't understand. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm left with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one issue I'd like to that's a little bit overlooked. I think, as far as I understand it, there's sort of tentative empirical evidence for a multiverse, but not exactly a multiverse that would account for fine tuning. Because in inflationary cosmology, a lot of scientists think if you combine that with quantum theory, then you're going to get this what's called eternal inflation, where you've got this rapidly expanding sort of mega space, and then these bubble universes, these bubbles that slow down within that mega universe, and we're one of those bubbles. So it's sort of lots of universes in this mega space. But as far as I can see, there's no empirical reason to think the parameters, the numbers of the physics in those different bubbles is different, which is, what you'd need to get an explanation of fine-tuning. And so people bring in string theory there because we can make sense of the possibility with string theory that you'd get different numbers in physics if the high dimensions in which the strings vibrate were different. Okay, that makes sense of the theoretical possibility, but still, as far as I can see, there's no empirical reason to think that this, that the high dimensional space in which the strings vibrate would be different in these different bubbles, and hence that we would get different kind of different laws of nature. And so it does come back to whether we can justify that extra step on the basis of the fine tuning, or whether that's a sort of fallacious inference. But yeah, I'm still trying to work this out. This is my project before
Christmas.
Christmas.
A good one. Well, I was just scrambling to find this reference. When Penrose won the Nobel Prize last week, there was a story that he issued some statements here about another universe existed before the Big Bang, and black holes could hold proof of its existence. He calls these Hawking points, spots of radiation in the cosmic background that are remnants of energy left over from a universe that existed before ours. So that would be not a multiverse in the other sense, but a kind of a cyclical sequence of universes. And for me, that ends the problem of having to explain the beginning. There is no beginning. It just goes infinitely back.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course, we'll have to see if that pans out scientifically with the research on black holes. But so I think the idea is that gravitational wave astronomy could find evidence of other universes or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had a chat with Penrose about that. So he's got that cyclical model. I hadn't really thought of that. So that used to be one of the early approaches to the multiverse. Was it Wheeler had the kind of cyclical, and then it went out of fashion when we discovered the expansion speed of the universe. And then, but Penrose is revisiting that, and it's above my pay grade to assess how plausible that is. But Penrose did raise another problem with the standard multiverse, the so-called Boltzmann brain problem that a lot of theists have latched onto, but that it tends to be assumed that for a multiverse theory to be sort of plausible, our universe has to be pretty normal. So, and then we qualify that because, of course, for anthropic reasons, we have to exist in a universe where life is possible. So then we take the set of universes where there are observers, and still we have to make sense that in that set of universes, we're not that unusual, right? It would be weird to have a multiverse theory where all the universes except ours are static and we're the only one that's expanding. That would be really implausible. Right. So, and then the Penrose's Boltzmann brain problem comes in, because you need a little bit of order to have an observer, but you don't need that much order. You could just have a solar system of order. You don't need this huge ordered universe. And in fact, so for this reason, in the multiverse, as it's standardly understood in eternal inflation, there would be many, many more. Where there are observers, there would be standardly much smaller amount of order than we find in our universe. And in fact, Penrose calculates the most common kind of observer are these Boltzmann brains that just pop into existence from random quantum fluctuations. They just outnumber us massively. So it looks like our universe is really, really weird, and most people think that's a problem for the multiverse hypothesis. I guess, multiverse theorists tend to respond to this by saying, okay, well, we take that as a constraint. Yeah. We have to avoid the Boltzmann brains. But now you've got the situation where, on the one hand, you want enough universes to explain the fine tuning, but not too many that you get all these Boltzmann brains. And then some people think, oh, it's starting to look like it's fine tuned again, because it's sort of exactly the right number of universes that you account for the fine tuning, but you don't get these Boltzmann brains. Oh wow, it's so nicely fun. So yeah, these
terms we throw around. It gets back to your point about science understanding the true nature of things that it doesn't. It studies relationships. So thinking about this, when supernaturalists talk about the supernatural, the paranormal, whatever, I say there's no such thing. These are just words you're using to describe things we can't yet explain. Once they're explained, then they're incorporated into natural science. So, for example, No, this isn't actually a problem that he's explaining. But let's say people really could read other people's minds or read the back of Zener cards or playing cards or something like that. And then somebody devised a theory like Penrose and Stuart Hameroff of quantum consciousness, the collapse of the wave function inside the microtubules of neurons causes my neurons to fire in a certain pattern, and that affects your neurons, and you can read my thoughts. Okay, I'm skeptical of this theory, but let's say it's true. That would just be incorporated into physics and neuroscience. It'd be quantum consciousness or whatever. That wouldn't be supernatural. It would be natural. We just found another structure of nature. And my analogy is that, when scientists talk about dark matter and dark energy, they don't mean that as an explanation. Those are just words, linguistic placeholders, until they figure out what it is. But then I was thinking, what you were saying earlier, what if we discovered, it's neutrinos that are causing the galaxies to rotate it a certain way, or it's this form of energy? We're still just using words to describe what the neutrinos do. They cause galaxies to rotate in a certain speed or something like that. We still haven't really gotten down to the core of what the answer is, right?
Yeah, I'm completely on board with that thought. I mean, I always find when you have discussions about, people want to categorize you as either you're into God and supernatural stuff, or you're into science and you're a materialist. And, I've never sort of felt happy with either category, and, I'm completely right. I would say, I'm not saying we can't have a scientific explanation of consciousness. I'm saying we need a more expansive conception of science. But as you say, once we expand it, then it will be science. And I think perhaps you're right that the term supernatural is kind of vacuous for that reason. I did a podcast with a host who it's a pretty good podcast actually, but I guess the host is more sympathetic to telepathy and psychic phenomena and so on. And I should read your stuff actually. This is just not something I've ever. People are always asking me what I think about this stuff, and I haven't really just looked at the evidence at all, or I suppose I'm naturally kind of skeptical. But anyway, they were hoping that as a panpsychist, I think this was made more sense of telepathy, but I think telepathy, a materialist could make sense of telepathy. There could be, if there were non-local connections between brains, that could just be, that could easily be, that could be a phenomenon of nature. I don't think it helps to be a panpsychist. But I completely agree with your final point as well, that whatever the scientific explanation ultimately gets to it's just telling us what stuff does. It's mathematical models to predict the behavior of matter. And I think we're currently going through a phase of history where people are so blown away by how well that's gone and incredible technology. And it has a visceral effect on you. And it makes people think this is everything. We've found the truth but I think, it's gone so well because it was a limited project of saying what stuff does. And Hawking, before he hated philosophy, in the end of the brief history of time, said, even when we have the grand unified theory, that'll be a bunch of equations. We want to know what breathes fire into the equations. And really, so that's what, the panpsychist view is. We just have a view about what breathes fire into the equations. So, I liked Hawking more.
That's a beautiful way to put it, Philip. That's a great way to end this conversation. Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. Congratulations on the book. I love the book. And I look forward to reading your next one.
Thank you very much, Michael. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Really good.
Lots to think about.
Totally.